Hey everyone, welcome to another Deep Dive Explainer. If you're tuning in for our long-form content, it's because you love taking these massive, complex geopolitical puzzles and breaking them down with some hard data. So let's just jump right in. Today, we are unraveling the deeply complex, multi-decade unraveling of U.S.-Venezuela relations. This is a crazy story of economic interdependence, massive ideological shifts, global power struggles, and ultimately a spectacular collision. We're going to unpack exactly how two nations went from being highly lucrative trade partners to fierce adversaries locked in a seemingly endless conflict.
Let's start with that unprecedented flashpoint from May 2026. The literal arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro by the United States. Instantly, we saw two violently polarized realities collide. To the U.S. Justice Department, hey, this was the apprehension of a narco-terrorist to enforce global justice. But to the Venezuelan government and its allies, they called it an illegal kidnapping and a blatant imperialist excuse for regime change. But, to really grasp how we got to a moment where a sitting head of state is detained by a foreign power, we got to rewind the clock.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll dissect the recent flashpoint, step back to their former oil alliance, and trace the escalation through Chávez's nationalization, the economic war, the geopolitical chessboard, and finally, the ultimate battleground, the petrodollar.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, an unprecedented flashpoint. To really understand the global shockwave of this arrest, you have to look at the specific legal levers Washington pulled here. The U.S. didn't just arrest Maduro on vague political grounds. The Department of Justice explicitly zeroed in on narco-terrorism and cocaine importation. Why frame it exactly like that? Well, it's incredibly strategic. It taps right into profound U.S. domestic sensitivities. The American public has been absolutely devastated by the opioid and cocaine crises. So by framing the Venezuelan leadership as the architects of this drug influx, Washington pretty much guarantees robust public and voter support for some really hardline, unprecedented interventions. It literally transforms a complex geopolitical dispute into a highly emotional domestic security issue.
Moving right along to Section 2, the former oil alliance. It is honestly kinda hard to believe now, but back in the 20th century, Washington and Caracas were incredibly lucrative partners. It was a classic case of geography being destiny. Venezuela is right there in the Caribbean, literally just days away from the US by ship, which may transport dirt cheap compared to hauling oil from the Middle East. Plus, Venezuela's heavy, sulfur-rich crude was like a perfect puzzle piece for specialized US refineries. It was a goldmine of an alliance. But there was a fatal flaw. All that immense wealth generated, it was concentrated almost entirely in the hands of the Venezuelan political elite, completely bypassing the general population.
And you can only stretch that kind of structural inequality so far. When global oil prices crashed in 1986, the Venezuelan economy essentially imploded. Look at this data. By 1989, poverty skyrocketed to a massive 45%. And the government's response to the protests that followed? A bloody military crackdown. That whole era violently alienated the Venezuelan population from the U.S.-aligned elites who had ruled for decades, and it set the perfect stage for a radical political overhaul.
Which brings us to Section 3, Chávez and nationalization. So all that domestic turmoil paved the way for an ideological shift that basically changed the Western Hemisphere forever. In 1998, Hugo Chávez, a total outsider, was elected on a fiercely pro-poor, anti-imperialist platform. He promised to use oil wealth for social programs instead of lining elite pockets. But to pull that off, he needed total control. Fast forward to the 2000s, Venezuela demands massive state control over the highly lucrative Orinoco oil belt. When foreign companies pushed back, they were shown the door. By the mid-2000s, U.S. oil giants like ExxonMobil had to completely exit, leaving billions in investments behind. And Washington didn't take that lying down. They retaliated through the courts, leading to the late 2000s seizure of $1.4 billion in shares of Citgo, which is a U.S.-based subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company.
Man, the reaction from Caracas was explosive. They looked at the Citgo seizure and called it, quote, an act of state-sponsored robbery from Washington. What used to be this mutually lucrative partnership had completely mutated into a bitter, toxic cycle of expropriation and retaliation. The gloves were officially off.
Let's step into Section 4, Sanctions and Economic War.
Because when diplomatic spats weaponize into sheer economic force, the footprint is just devastating. Check out this chart. In the 1990s, Venezuela was pumping out around 3 million barrels of oil a day. By the 2020s, that plummeted to somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000 barrels. This is what happens when an over-reliant oil economy just buckles under heavy, hyper-targeted U.S. sanctions designed to choke off their absolute lifeblood.
And the tightening of this economic vice happened in very calculated steps. Step 1. The Bush administration halts weapons sales and freezes the personal assets of officials over terrorism claims. Step 2. We hit 2017, and the Trump administration seriously escalates by blocking Venezuela from securing any new debt financing from U.S. investors, which crippled their ability to raise cash. Finally, Step 3, 2019, Washington drops the hammer with a complete embargo on state oil transactions and freezes global assets. The clear goal here? Maximum pressure to force a change in policy, or just a complete change in regime.
Next up is Section 5, the geopolitical chessboard.
So what actually happens when a country gets entirely cut off from Western markets? Well, Maduro managed to survive by actively trading regional influence for lifelines for America's major global rivals. Russia stepped in with billions in military equipment, establishing a foothold right there. China offered massive debt for oil loans, built critical infrastructure, and crucially, installed advanced intelligence radar systems. And Iran provided the complex trade and shipping networks necessary to completely bypass Western financial blockades.
Now, from Washington's perspective, this completely shifted the stakes. The U.S. no longer viewed this as just some local political dispute over democracy or human rights. They saw Russian military assets and Chinese intelligence networks operating right in their own backyard as severe, direct threats to the security of the entire Western Hemisphere. Venezuela had basically become the central node for anti-U.S. influence in Latin America.
And that brings us to the final, and honestly, probably the most crucial layer of this whole explainer in Section 6, challenging the petrodollar. Because look, beyond regional security, this touches the very mechanics of global financial hegemony. Just as a quick refresher, the petrodollar system, where global oil is predominantly traded in U.S. dollars, grants the U.S. unbelievable leverage. It allows Washington to export its inflation, print money at lower costs, and essentially weaponize its financial system against adversaries exactly like they did to Venezuela. Now, I want you to look at this number, 303 billion. That is the staggering number of proven oil barrels sitting beneath Venezuela right now. It represents roughly 17% of the entire world's supply. And the nation with the absolute largest oil reserves on the planet was actively working to sell that oil completely outside of the US dollar system.
And they were doing it through these exact methods: trading oil directly in Chinese yuan and Indian rupees, utilizing bilateral barter systems, literally trading oil for goods without money even changing hands, and moving gold through non-dollar intermediary networks alongside Russia and Iran. For Washington, this isn't just an annoyance. The prospect of the world's largest oil reserves successfully dismantling the petrodollar system, that is terrifying. It's a massive step toward a multipolar financial world where U.S. sanctions essentially lose all their teeth.
Which circles us right back to the immediate fallout of that crazy May 2026 arrest. With Maduro detained, the whole dynamic shifted instantly. By May 9, 2026, Venezuela's new vice president initiated exploratory diplomatic talks with the U.S. And as a unilateral show of good faith, she released the first batch of political prisoners. While those deep, historical wounds definitely remain, this sudden shift really hinted at a new, cautious opening for pragmatic coexistence between Washington and Caracas. Which leaves us with this final thought to consider. We've traced the history from a super lucrative oil partnership to the dramatic May 2026 arrest. But as you look at how fast the global landscape is shifting, you really have to ask yourself, as the world moves toward a multipolar system, is this multi-decade conflict truly just about enforcing justice and restoring democracy? Or are we simply watching the ultimate battleground for the future of global financial supremacy? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning those headlines, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.